So every time a woman or some non-prototypical person takes a job, you chip away at people's sense of who gets to do that job. And at first it might be a shock that you look and sound not like any predecessors. Mm-hmm. But then gradually people get used to you and you become normal.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada and small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. The Right Honourable Kim Campbell, Canada's first female Prime Minister, in office from June 25, 1993, when she succeeded Brian Mulroney as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, until the federal election in November 1993. To this day, still the only female Prime Minister in Canada's history. Ms Campbell was Canada's first female Justice Minister and Attorney General, first female Minister of National Defence and Veterans Affairs, and the first woman to represent a member country at a NATO meeting. Born in Port Alberni, BC, Campbell was called to the BC Bar in 1984. She practiced law in Vancouver until 1986, when she was first elected to the Legislative Assembly as a member of the BC Social Credit Party. She was elected to the House of Commons as a Progressive Conservative in 1988. As Justice Minister and Attorney General, the House passed several legislative changes regarded as successes, including stronger gun control laws and a rape law which gave women more protections. After leaving politics, Campbell became a fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and served as Canadian Consul General in Los Angeles, 1996 to 2000. Kim has been a long-time global advocate for education, democracy, and women's issues during her political career to present day. She has held leadership roles for a range of relevant nonprofit organizations, including the Council of Women World Leaders and the International Women's Forum. In this episode, Ms Campbell is being interviewed by Pascasie Minani, postgraduate student at the University of Ottawa.
So let's start at the beginning. What were the defining moments that made you the feminist that you have been throughout your adult lifetime?
Well, I was raised by a mother who, I don't know if she described herself as a feminist, but she certainly was. She was a very independent woman. She horrified her mother by enlisting in the Navy in World War II, becoming a wireless operator. And she raised my sister and me to believe that girls could do anything, but to understand that that wasn't always a universally accepted proposition. And we were raised on people like Charlotte Whitten, who was the first woman mayor of Ottawa. And she used to say that a woman had to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good. But fortunately, that's easy. So we were raised to believe that girls could and should do anything, but that sometimes they faced pushback. So I think I grew up wanting to break down barriers for women. That was something that I wanted to do. And when I was a teenager, I wanted to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN.
Wow.
Didn't know how to do that, and obviously didn't become that, but that was the kind of ambition I had. So I thought, I didn't like the idea of limits on girls. We could do anything, so we should not be limited.
Perfect. So your background helps you as your environment.
Yeah. Well, because I was never raised to think that as a girl I couldn't do something, and that's very helpful. Because a lot of young women are raised to think that there are things that they shouldn't do or their parents don't encourage them, and that wasn't the case for me.
Et avant de vous lancer en politique fédérale, vous avez déjà été active en politique municipale et provinciale. Quels sont les hauts et les bas que vous avez eu à à faire face des défis, c'est-à-dire en sortant du municipal, en politique provinciale, de provincial au fédéral?
Les trois niveaux sont chacun est très important. Mais le focus est un peu différent. Pour le gouvernement municipal, c'était le conseil des écoles, où j'ai servi. C'est plus intime. Vous êtes là avec vos, l'électorat. On ne va pas autre place pour les servir. Et les effets de vos décisions sont immédiats. Donc, pour moi, c'est une excellente expérience pour développer les instincts comme un politicien. Vous comprenez clairement que les effets sont sur les personnes réelles. C'est pas abstrait. C'est les personnes réelles qui sont affectées par vos décisions, et aussi pour développer la capacité de rencontrer et parler avec les électeurs. Et pour moi, c'était toujours un plaisir. Même pour les politiciens des écoles, c'est très féroce. Mais c'est important parce que c'est la démocratie. C'est très important. Et ils ont le droit de pousser le conseil administratif pour les écoles et pour servir leurs enfants comme ils pensent important. Pour moi, c'était très important. Pour le gouvernement provincial, c'était une occasion où il faut travailler avec les gens aussi dans votre propre parti, mais qui arrivent des autres régions de la province. Parce qu'au Canada, pas pour les maritimes, mais Québec, Ontario, ils sont énormes. Et donc, il y a une diversité des expériences et des réalités, les économies, etc., sont différentes partout dans la province. Donc, il faut travailler avec les gens, vos collègues, qui ont les priorités différentes. Moi, je viens de Vancouver, je suis urbain au centre de la ville et toutes sortes de choses comme ça pour urbain. Mais j'ai eu des collègues qui sont venus des régions très loin de la capitale, avec les autres industries. Et ça, c'est une grande expérience formative pour apprendre votre société. Et aussi, j'ai voyagé partout dans la province parce que j'ai présidé de deux comités législatifs et pour gagner l'information nécessaire, j'ai dirigé des process pour rencontrer le public et écouter leurs idées et leurs problèmes. Par exemple, le procureur général a voulu faire des amendements à la loi de Builder's Lien. Ça, c'est une loi très importante pour l'industrie de construction, de permettre des gens de mettre une charge contre le titre d'un édifice pour garantir le paiement. Ça, ce n'est pas très romantique, mais c'était intéressant parce que partout dans la province, nous avons convenu des rencontres avec les gens qui ont été absolument horrifiés de prospect de parler en public. Et si vous posez une question de leur expertise et leur expérience, vous étiez tellement éloquent, effectif, et c'était très important d'apprendre ça. Parce que ça dépend de demander de quelqu'un d'exprimer une part de leur vie que vous intéresse, leurs expériences, qu'est-ce que vous pensez et peut améliorer cet arrangement et qu'est-ce que c'est votre expérience. Et c'est toujours très intéressant et les gens sont toujours très éloquents. Et ça, c'est très intéressant et agréable pour moi. Et donc, pour Ottawa, le problème, c'est qu'il faut aller très loin. Si on vient de Vancouver, mais aussi la même situation, mais plus large. Des collègues, des régions très différentes de la mienne, avec les priorités différentes, et il fallait partager et chercher les façons pour répondre à leurs priorités aussi. C'était une grande éducation pour moi de mon pays. C'était très, très intéressant. Même que je n'ai pas perfectionné mon français, vous pouvez entendre.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Alors, une autre question en anglais. You held a number of important portfolios, including Minister of National Defense, Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, and Minister of Justice. This is so big. What are the discourse around sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military or reconciliation with indigenous communities in the late 80s?
Well, it's interesting. I was the first woman to be Minister of National Defense, but I wasn't the first woman to have a defense portfolio because there was also a portfolio Associate Minister of National Defense. When I was minister, I didn't have an associate minister, but other ministers did. And my colleague Mary Collins served the minister before me, Marcel Mass, as his associate minister of national defense. And she started a process to deal with sexual harassment in the forces. The report came out when I was minister, but I have to give her credit for really pushing to get this report to try and understand it. I would hate to say that I think there may have been some improvements, but not enough. I think that in the military and in policing, we still face situations of considerable gender discrimination and harassment. And I don't know. And again, it may be this question that maybe some men feel that when women are in these fields, they're intruding on their territory, and yet it is very important for there to be women in the forces, in both the police forcing and in the armed forces. They bring very important qualities and capacities. And so, but because of what people think is a traditionally masculine culture, I mean, it's a very physical culture because of the need to be fit. Although nowadays, I mean, if you go into a Canadian ship and you go into the control room, it's so high tech. And you realize that there are no unskilled jobs in the forces anymore, that people have to have these very extraordinary technological skills. You see, if you watch the films about the war in Ukraine and these, soldiers out there with their drones and their, the controls and things that many of them have learned how to use by gaming. But the point is that the idea of the military as being simply people who were very strong and could carry heavy equipment. I mean, that's part of it too. But there are roles for a great many different kinds of people. And women have an important role to play. But they often find that there are men who feel that somehow, either these are women are not worthy of respect because they're doing something that a man is doing, or they're resentful. And I don't know the easy answer except to continue to expose it and forbid it and discipline people who break those norms. Very painful. And then in terms of the reconciliation, when I was in Indian Affairs, I was the Minister of State for Indian Affairs. I had a senior minister, Pierre Cadieux. And I always felt very uncomfortable being in a position of having anything to say about the way that Indigenous people lived, because I thought the relationship was, uncomfortable for me. I wasn't a colonialist at heart. But I always found that when I met with communities, and I traveled particularly around British Columbia, but also elsewhere in Canada, that people were very courteous to me. But one of the things that I was able to do as the Minister of State for Indian Affairs, I had worked for the Premier of British Columbia, the only time I ever worked as a political staff. And he had asked me to review what British Columbia's role should be in trying to resolve comprehensive land claims, because we had these comprehensive land claims, but they weren't going anywhere. So when I reviewed what the situation was, I said, it's actually a federal jurisdiction. We don't have any jurisdiction to do it. It affects us. It affects things that are, like the use of resources, which is a provincial jurisdiction, but we have no jurisdiction. So when I became Minister of State for Indian Affairs, the first thing I said is, we have to negotiate comprehensive land claims in British Columbia. And people in the department said, well, I don't know. I mean, that's would help British Columbia more than it would help us. And I say, yes, but we do lots of things that help one part of the country more than the other. And the last I looked, British Columbia was part of Canada, and it's our responsibility to do it. So in terms of the questions, I mean, reconciliation, which has come out of the process, really looking at residential schools and that wasn't on my plate at that time. But I was certainly aware of the extent to which there were many cultural casualties in Indigenous communities of people who had suffered from being taken away from their communities. Although I also met all sorts of really brilliant people. I mean, very, when people who had a chance to get an education, they became, excellent lawyers and administrators, etc. So I had a lot of respect for the communities, but I understood the extent to which they had been damaged. But the whole truth and reconciliation process really began after I was out of government. But in my own work, wanting to get comprehensive land claims negotiated, it was to clarify the Aboriginal rights of people in British Columbia, because in British Columbia, we were unusual in having a lot of unresolved claims. The rest of the country, a lot of it was treaty, like the Cree, the Treaty 8 and Treaty 6. These were old treaties that were in place. And British Columbia didn't have treaties. So there were unresolved land claims, and it made for great uncertainty over resource rights, who had rights in forests and mining, etc., and also how to ensure that if Indigenous people had rights, and if they were going to exploit resources, they would get their share of the revenue from it. So I wish I could say that I started a process that immediately resolved everything. I didn't. I started a process that resulted in creating a treaty commission, and it has worked slowly. But in the meantime, some other court cases have overtaken those negotiations. So I certainly recognized that there was a lot of unfinished business, and that I wanted to be, to do what I could about it. But the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission and process came sometime after I was out of government.
On sait très bien qu'à travers votre carrière, vous avez eu à surmonter les défis en tant que femme en politique. Quels sont les conseils que vous pouvez donner aux femmes qui veulent se lancer en politique, les jeunes générations, mais aussi aux femmes racisées? Parce que là, on s'entend très bien qu'il y a les barrières qui s'adressent à toutes les femmes canadiennes, mais il y a aussi d'autres barrières additionnelles qui s'adressent spécifiquement aux femmes racisées.
Il sont des barrières, mais moins qu'avant. Et dans un sens aussi, les barrières différentes, parce que ça change toujours. La démocratie est très importante. Il ne faut pas laisser la démocratie aux hommes, ou les hommes, les personnes privilégiées. Il faut avoir vraiment un processus démocratique pour faire nos lois et pour avoir les voix de tout le monde dans cette processus de discuter et analyser et décider comment on peut résoudre des problèmes variés. Et donc, je dis aux femmes, go for it. C'est important de faire. Je pense de la génération de mes parents les deux sont dans les forces armées pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Mon père dans l'armée en Italie, ma mère dans les forces navires. Et pour leur génération, ils ont dit que mon père m'a dit que nous n'étions pas les héros, mais nous avons vu qu'il y avait un job that had to be done, un défi qu'il fallait répondre. Et les jeunes maintenant ont les autres défis. Même il faut protéger ce qu'on a gagné par de faire le fascisme en Europe, par exemple. Mais il faut continuer toujours de bâtir et renforcer les fondations de la démocratie, et toujours de pousser les frontières, d'identifier les autres communautés qui sont marginalisées, et les enfranchiser et inclure dans la communauté démocratique. Chaque génération a ses propres défis. Et maintenant, on a vraiment le défi du climat, mais aussi de résurgence de fascisme, de authoritarian governments, les menaces à la démocratie. Il n'est jamais un temps où on peut se coucher et dire, ah, c'est tout fait, je peux dormir, c'est un pilote automatique. Non, jamais. Et c'est très important pour les femmes de participer parce que ils vivent une réalité spécifique. Et c'était très important d'avoir cette réalité parmi les considérations quand on veut décider comment régler des choses. Si les femmes sont absentes, qui sait? Et cette ignorance, fréquemment, dans le passé, ce n'était pas parce que les hommes ne voulaient pas protéger les femmes, mais ils étaient ignorants, ils ne pouvaient pas comprendre. Quand j'étais ministre de la Justice, j'ai convenu une conférence, un séminaire à Vancouver au sujet de la loi, les femmes et l'administration de la justice. C'était un symposium. Et c'était parce que j'étais la première femme d'être ministre de la Justice, il fallait le marquer dans un sens, donc j'ai convaincu cette conférence. Et c'était intéressant parce que nous avons, les avocates de mon département ont voyagé partout au pays pour discuter avec les gens, pour mettre sur l'agenda d'un tel symposium, etc., etc. C'était très riche, la discussion. Mais il y avait un nombre de juges qui sont venus parce qu'ils ont su que si c'était le ministre de la Justice qui était la hôtesse, que ça va protéger leur indépendance, etc. Mais il y avait un nombre qui ont dit, avant cette symposium, j'ai pensé que j'étais libéral. Je réalise, je n'ai su rien. Je ne savais rien. Et ça, c'était très important parce qu'ils ont réalisé, ils n'ont jamais entendu les voix des femmes exprimant leur situation, comment la loi était pour elles. Et c'était très important de faire ça. Et donc, pour tout ma carrière politique, j'ai fait des conversations et des consultations avec un grand nombre de peuples. Et la deuxième femme d'être ministre de la Justice au Canada, Anne McClellan, m'a dit que quand elle est devenue ministre de la Justice, les gens du département l'ont demandé, voulez-vous suivre la Campbell mode de consultation? Et elle a dit, oui, qu'est-ce que c'est le Campbell mode de consultation? Ils ont dit, beaucoup plus large que normal. Non seulement les associations des avocats et de la Society et Canadian Bar, mais plus large. Et quand j'ai fait la loi d'assaut sexuel, le Rape Shield Law, nous avons parlé avec les organisations des femmes de couleur à Toronto, les femmes, les sex workers, all sorts of communities dont l'expérience de la loi de sexual assaults était différente parce que n'ont pas été traités les mêmes par les polices, ils n'ont pas eu la même possibilité d'avoir la justice. Et c'était très, très, très important. Il fallait parler avec elle. C'était intéressant pour moi d'apprendre que dans le département, on a définir une Campbell mode de consultation, mais ça vous protège contre les grandes erreurs. Si vous n'entendez pas la réalité, vous allez faire beaucoup de choses stupides et de façon innocente. Oh, qui a su? Yeah, well, you should know. Because if you talk to people, you would know.
Great. So the next question is on your position as Canada's first female prime minister, how it was for you to be the first woman?
In some ways, it was wonderful. I mean, it was a great honor, and especially when I would meet young women, and I still meet young women who say, you know, when you became prime minister, it was so important to me. Or when you became prime minister, my dad said, see, girls can do anything. You know, so to be the vehicle of that was wonderful. But I also was worried because I knew that the timing was very bad. We were at the end of a mandate. There wasn't time for me to put a new face on the government, and my predecessor was very unpopular. You know, otherwise he probably would have run again. And you know, and it doesn't mean that he wasn't a good prime minister or that he doesn't, you know, that people don't appreciate now. But it's like, you know, when Pierre Trudeau left office, people just hated him, and Brian Mulroney was very unpopular. So it was very difficult to put a new face on his party to do things differently. But I tried, you know, in everything I ever did in politics, I always tried to make a difference and, you know, use the opportunity. And one of the things I did when I was prime minister was I redesigned the ministries of the government because I wanted to appoint my cabinet. I wanted a smaller cabinet. But you can't just appoint a smaller cabinet and, you know, leave some ministries unpopulated. You have to figure out how you can consolidate and change ministries. And so I, you know, created the Department of Canadian Heritage. I created the freestanding Department of Health because I thought that was important. And, you know, and I made some changes, and some of them have been kept, some of them not. But I also, you know, I did a G7 summit, and I was only the second woman ever to do a G7 summit. Margaret Thatcher had done them. So it was very wonderful to know that I was breaking a mold, but it was also worrisome because I thought if we lose the election, I hope it doesn't put the cause of women back. And it may be that I'm just flattering and comforting myself, but my feeling over the years since is that people didn't see our defeat as a repudiation of a woman as prime minister, because in the summer of 1993, Gallup said that I had the highest approval rating for a prime minister in 30 years. So I think Canadians liked it, but it was just the wrong situation that I was leading a government, and we could have had a different approach, but it takes time to communicate that. And Canadians like to change their government too, and that's a healthy thing in a democracy. So, but I think that many people I speak to remember how wonderful they felt when there was a woman prime minister. They don't feel that, you know, because I lost the election, that negates that. I mean, some might, but I meet many who say this to me, that it still meant so much to them. And many who say, you know, we've had a woman prime minister. You know, Americans still haven't had a woman president. You know, we need to have another one, and we need to have one that has a chance to win a general election.
Yes.
But it was a great honor to be the person who was able to be the first. But it would have probably been easier for me if I'd been the 10th, because I wouldn't have had that. You know, when nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. And you're just a shock, particularly for, you know, the Ottawa Press Gallery, who thinks they own the system. And, you know, it's just hard. So you go out there and then you do the best you can to redefine who gets to do that job, knowing that it will take more than one to do that. But I think, you know, when Angela Merkel was elected leader of the Christian Democratic Party, I was with a bunch of my friends from an organization of former presidents and prime ministers. And I said, the German Social Democrats have elected a woman as leader. Germany could have a woman chancellor. And one of the men said, oh no, she won't be chancellor. If they win the election, so-and-so will be chancellor. And I thought, I don't think so. Well, it was just so impossible for him to imagine a woman as chancellor of Germany. But lo and behold, there she was. And now she was in office for so long. You know, when she left, we thought, oh yeah, they used to have men in that job. You know, it just was no longer strange. So every time a woman or some non-prototypical person takes a job, you chip away at people's sense of who gets to do that job. And at first it might be a shock that you look and sound not like any predecessors.
Mhm.
But then gradually people get used to you and you become normal. And that's the best thing. I didn't have time to become normal, but I think it was an honor to at least, be the first step.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much. Even though you said that you didn't have the chance to become a normal, beyond your political career, you have been actively involved in global initiatives supporting women leadership.
Mhm.
So could you share any particular experiences or stories that highlight the power of women becoming together to effect the positive change in the world generally?
Well, there are a number of organizations that I'm involved with, the Council of Women World Leaders, which is now well over 60 members of women presidents and prime ministers. And our purpose is to make women leaders visible. So again, to normalize the idea of women in the top positions of either head of government or head of state. And I belong to I was the president of the International Women's Forum, and in the Club of Madrid, which is an organization of former presidents and prime ministers, men and women. With them, I've gone to a lot of countries to talk about democratic transition, whatever. And I'm often invited to speak about women in leadership. I often talk about the subject. And so I have a chance to share things that I've learned over the years. I've learned a lot since I was in office, because after I was out of office, throughout the rest of the 90s, there was a growing body of research about the kinds of barriers that women or non-prototypical people face. Things like implicit attitudes, various kinds of barriers to decision making and barriers to inclusion. And I've been able to speak widely on a lot of those and relate them to my own experiences. So, my goal has been to try and inform men and women, not just women, but men and women, of how we can unwittingly often create barriers, and what we need to know to prevent them from letting good people serve and do what they can do. So I think that's really, I've seen it, and many organizations that, young women who've been encouraged to run for office or get involved. And I created a leadership college at the University of Alberta, and many young women there who were very eager to play their part. So I don't, pretend that I've changed the world, but I'm committed to sharing what I know to both empower people with knowledge to understand when they're meeting barriers, and then to encourage them to continue and to have the nerve to do it, because it matters. Because going back to what you asked me before, it really does matter to have diverse representative people deciding how we live together as a country. And we will never be as successful if we don't do that. We'll always leave people out and leave things unlearned that we should learn.
Yeah. Thank you again. And talking about your accomplishments, what are the 2 or 3 initiatives that you want to be remembered for?
Oh, golly, because it depends. I mean, when I was on the school board in Vancouver, I brought in the International Baccalaureate to Vancouver schools, which I thought was an important thing. When I was in the legislature, I chaired a task force called Project Pride about heritage conservation. We had no laws about preserving old buildings or old sites in British Columbia. And I toured the province with a task force, and we wrote a report, and it became the white paper for the first heritage conservation bill. So it's not like earth-shaking, but I still meet people who enjoy that. And then when I was in Parliament, I think things I was able to do as justice, in Indian Affairs, being able to get the Comprehensive Land Claims Treaty going, the things I did in justice, gun control, Human Rights Act amendments, the sexual assault law, and then even in national defense. We had an atrocity when the Canadian forces were in Somalia, and I pushed to get an inquiry. And although there were people who didn't understand what I was doing, although it later came out, I felt that I led my department in pushing back against people who didn't want me to do anything. So I think But also there's just little things you do every day. And, I take pleasure and pride in the successful consultations I had, my symposium in Vancouver, which generated a lot of wonderful ideas for legislation and helped to raise the profile of issues of women in the law. So, but I don't look at them and say, look at me, I'm a big hero. There's always more problems to solve and more people come along. But I think the most important thing was not to feel that I wasted my time. I did what I could and tried to empower other people to do good things too. Right. And then eventually the public retires you and you have to let the next group come in and do what they can.
Well, thank you so much. I have the last question. What is making you most hopeful at this time when it comes to women's political participation? And what do you want our listeners and viewers to know as they continue their leadership journey?
Well, what makes me most hopeful is just that there are more women. And I think of, for example, two leaders, Angela Merkel, who she made some mistakes too, but Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And I mean, Prime Minister Ardern was very much admired, and people, from outside New Zealand were sorry when she went, but she was a real politician, and she had opposition. She was easy, but these are women, and I see some of the women in the Baltic states now, and the president of Estonia, who's so strong on the war in Ukraine, and all. These are women that are redefining who the strong leaders are, and it's not just to encourage women to do it. It's important for men. You're meant to understand that wonderful women leaders are their partners. And that when a woman leads well, he benefits too. And his family benefits. So we need good leadership of all kinds. So I think I see some progress, but what I am concerned about is the rise of populism, because populism is not good for girls. Populism often rests on very negative, disempowering views of women's role. So we have to push back against that. So we're not out of the woods, we're not out of danger, but we have a lot more women on the front lines now. So that gives me optimism.
Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guest. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.